I'm always interested in the off moments because I think the off moments are when we think no one's looking, and that's where truth happens. So I suppose that's what fascinates me.
So many terrific issues to dive into with your film, so much to talk about. I'd like to start off by talking about the issue of identity, though. I think in so many of your characters, the destruction and creation of identity and how it relates to the losing and the gaining of power. Do you see your characters as searching for identity? I think so many of them actually really are.
God, it's always terrifying when someone analyses your work like that. I really haven't thought about it. God, I've got some clever now. I think a lot of the time I'm trying to capture characters and points of change, and I guess identity is part of that change. I mean, I always felt when I worked with, when I looked at, I think what attracted me to The Iron Lady was that it's about the loss of power and the power of loss. So I think there is probably a reoccurring themes of loss and change.
Yeah.
So I guess that would be at the heart. But I honestly have never gone through my work like that. So I'm going to go home now like a nerd and do that.
That's what we do as critics. We go through your work and we find, there's a theme there, there's something there. You're a terrific observer, though, of idiosyncrasies, and you're an observer, I think, of how inner urges can be relayed in a character sense. Where does that come from? Are you naturally an observer of people?
Yeah, I definitely am. My husband's in the audience somewhere, and he would definitely say that. I definitely people watch. I mean, often see photos of myself with my children, and I'm always in the background with my mouth wide open, looking somewhere else, and I definitely think I'm like, and I'm staying in New York at the moment, obviously, and I find New York such an amazing city, and it's so diverse, and I love the characters. And so just this morning having breakfast, I just went to Cat's Deli, which I know is the most tourist thing in the world to do, but I just was so fascinated by the people who work there and everyone coming, and less about the people coming in actually because we were tourists, but the people who work there really fascinated me. So yeah, I think it probably comes from being a child of actors and who are constantly performing, and so you do spend a lot of time being in the audience, and so I'm kind of interested in, I'm always interested in the off moments because I think the off moments are when we think no one's looking, and that's where truth happens. So I suppose that's what fascinates me.
I've always thought that the dinner scene in Shame, which we just saw a clip of, feels very much as if we're observing them from the other table, like over there, and it's an interesting interaction because not much is said, but everything is said, right?
Yeah, I mean, in a weird way. I mean, a lot of the I love Billy Wilder, and a lot of that dialogue is quite heightened and quite funny and quite slick, but it has rhythm. Yeah. And actually, I think I quite like to make rhythm quite ragged in dialogue, but for me, it's got an energy to it. So although it may seem off the cuff, and I like finding what the energy of the dialogue is, even if it's not always neat and it's not always formed. And I mean, certainly that scene's very interesting because I think Steve's chosen to literally shoot it as if it is from another table. And that scene was really, that scene came out of eating a lot of room service and eating a lot in the restaurant and the standard here. And food is a big part of my life because I love food and love cooking and I love menus. And so a lot of that is, it's the fascination of, I love restaurants because I love looking at people. And as a writer, you do often end up being in hotels eating on your own. I was in New York in January, and I started to get embarrassed because I was going on my own so much to one restaurant. And yeah, it was also just the joy of sitting there and watching.
What do you love about menus, I have to ask? That's a terrific little aside.
Just kind of, you can only ever order one thing, can't you? And so it's the other lives you would have lived if you'd gone for the...
The BLT is one life, right?
Yeah.
The filet mignon another.
It's always the BLT for me.
It's always the BLT.
it's never the green salad. Come on.
No.
It's never going to be the green salad.
No. You only live once, no green salad. How did you get started in the business? I know you started writing, late teens started writing your plays, but how did you really kind of get your plays going?
Oh, I think it's just that it's the champions you find along the way. And actually, I remember very clearly bumping into a young woman who was the year below me at university, and I was a waitress at the time, and in the day I worked as a caretaker, and I was 28, and I kept thinking, God, I'm going to be the oldest waitress in town. And all my friends were, they were moving into they were having careers, and they were buying flats, and I just got talking and said, I've been trying to write this play, and she said, send it to me. And she at the time worked for Sam Mendes, and she showed it to Sam Mendes, and he'd said, it's not a good play, but isn't there some kind of screenwriting course? It's a weekend that they're doing with a TV company, and that was a real turning point for me because I discovered screenwriting, and that was the revelation, was that it was in so many ways I didn't have to write the long monologue that I'd written in theatre. I could suddenly go back to the leanness of dialogue that I loved and allow the image to be the monologue. And so I think that was the turning point. And I was incredibly grateful to this young woman, who's now a friend actually, but because I didn't really know her beyond being someone who's the year below me at college. So
that's very interesting. Life is in the editing, isn't it? And that you're really knowing what to take out and how to pare things down. You had written a lot of plays, though, that obviously never saw the light of day. Did you learn something from doing all of those that sort of just wound up in a drawer somewhere?
Well, I mean, I actually just written one play that I kept on rewriting. So I you know, and I mean, my first play was called Skinned, and it was based around the National Front, which is the right wing, you know, racist right wing that we have in the UK, and thankfully is dying out. And it was about set in an abattoir, and so I went to an abattoir for a week, and it fascinated me because one room was the abattoir where the men all worked, and one room, and they killed the animals, and the other room was where they packed the animals, and they were all women, and I couldn't get over the difference. When I walked through the women, they were all talking, and it was very calm, and I walked through the men's room, and it was all like, all right, love, get your kit off, you know, it was very aggressive, and so I set it in this world of an abattoir, and it was about racism, basically, in the UK, and it was about the death of a young Asian worker there. And I rewrote that play, and it took me about 3 years, and eventually that play got read, and that was the play that led to me getting TV work, and eventually it got done. So it was that journey, really.
Let's talk about the TV work, which started with shorter form things, but the long form work that became The Hour. But I'd like to talk about the shorter form work at first, because Sex Traffic, you won a BAFTA for, and it's a tremendous work, but it's very intense. It's almost documentary-like in feel. What were those early experiences in TV like for you?
Oh, I just think that they were, you know, I think they were amazing. You know, I think one of the things when you grow up with actors is that you don't have any control. You know, you watch your parents waiting to get the part, or, you know, and waiting for a script to arrive, and suddenly if you've written the script, you've made the script, and you can be part of that process. It was wonderful, and it was for the first time I was making money. I mean, you know, I think no one forgets what an incredibly. Everyone says your 20s are wonderful. It's hard, your 20s, because you're trying to make money, you're trying to find your voice, you're trying to fall in love, you're trying to find your friends, you know, beyond your family, you're trying to find yourself. And so I found something that was in part about finding myself, but it also made me money. And that was a big revelation for me. And so I think my early experience is interesting. Well, my first television piece was a 2-parter called My Fragile Heart. And it was about a woman who goes back to investigate the death of someone she knew, and she connects with a man she knew. And that was very interesting, because I literally went back to my hometown and shot in that hometown, and there were some extras there from my school, and that was, I think, do you call them extras over here? You know, background artists, and that was really interesting, because that felt like a real sort of full circle. But for me, television was a revelation, because I love the intimacy of television. I love how it can be quietly political. I love the fact that you can tell it eats story, so it demands a lot from you. It keeps telling you to write more. And I love the kind of quiet political intimacy of it. I love the fact that you can be on your own. I mean, it's a different world now, so we watch on our phones and we watch on our laptops, and we very rarely tune in on the night. But still, it's an intimate act, and I like the fact that it quietly changes you, and no one else can be watching. So I love it as a medium. So for me, it really, I mean, it sounds a bit twee, but I felt like this incredible sense of relief, because I was about to become a teacher, and I would have been a terrible teacher, and I think it's the hardest, greatest job in the world to be a good teacher, and so I think the teaching profession was saved. Maybe the TV profession wasn't saved, but you know, and that's how I got into that.
And it was cinema's gain, of course, for getting. I love what you said about as you became in your 40s, you know, the maturation of your art matched, obviously, growing older. Do you think The Iron Lady, Suffragette, Shame could have been written in your 20s? I feel like they're films that are informed by a mature point of view.
Yeah, I don't think they would have done. I mean, I think there is something interesting that happens when your life gets more content. You know, there was when I think I was younger and, you know, more conflicted and struggling, then that did create an incredible energy. And I guess there was a sort of inherent inward narcissism that everything had to come from me. And the older I've got, the more interested I am in seeing everything through the prism of other people. And so, although I'm sure I self-reflect, I think, the Iron Lady was very, the Iron Lady really came out of just a simple desire to wonder, I wonder if Margaret Thatcher ever goes out and buys a pint of milk. That was the starting point for me. I thought, what would it be like? What's it like if you have, been, one of the great leaders of the Western world, and you lose all of that. So, and that feels very relatable, because I knew what it was like to watch everybody else become incredibly successful and have nothing. So I definitely think you find your personal footprint through it, but the older I get, the more interested I'm in taking it away from myself.
The generosity, we'll talk about the Iron Lady right now for a moment, because we were just now. The Iron Lady strikes me, it's an extraordinary film, and I think it's a really extraordinary screenplay, because it really does so many things so right. It's an angry film. It rightly damns her for certain things, but it has such a generosity of spirit towards her personal life and towards the woman who had to be in that position. That generosity of spirit, was that something that as you were approaching it was immediately apparent, or did that just come through the process?
Well, I think it's really important, if you're going to create anybody, that you show the complexity of their character, and you can't, if you're going to create a monster, you want to show the goodness as well, because then you realize that they're colluding, and then the same with Margaret Thatcher. I think, whether she is reviled and revered, and that there is that complexity of feeling about her in the UK. I mean, she is hated. I grew up in a family that really hated her, and yet, when I was in my waitressing in my, late 80s, early 90s, I was waitressing at the National Portrait Gallery, and there was a birthday party for Sir William Whitelaw there, and it was for 20 people, and it was sort of, the members of the cabinet were having dinner together, ex-members of the cabinet, and I was walking out of the back with a tray of canapes, and I shoved a whole load in my mouth, and sort of stuffing my face. That's a running theme with me, and stuffing my face with food. And I turned around, and this old lady looked at me and smiled, and I thought, God, we're almost the same height. And it was Margaret Thatcher. And she was just smiled rather sweetly and walked on, and I thought, God, that's Margaret Thatcher. And so that slightly stayed with me in terms of she seemed like a sweet old lady. And then I looked at photos of her, and you'd see her in later life, and there'd be some bodyguard coming out, and you'd just see this sort of shadowy figure peering out from behind the door. And for me, it's the contradiction of the woman. It's the contradiction of a woman who can have such steel and, close down and destroy so much of the UK's industry, mining industry in particular, the steel industry, the car. I mean, you can go through every industry and watch it topple under her reign. And at the same time, you understand this is a woman who's felt huge emotional complexity and has a huge sense of pain about, for example, the sinking of the Belgrano and the results of the deaths of so many, and so it was about how do you house that in one character.
Yeah. You mentioned the politics of your parents during the 80s. What else inspired you during the 80s as you were growing up, artistically, creatively? What inspired you?
Television was a really big part of my growing up. TV went on Saturday morning, and that was your entertainment for the weekend for me. I mean, so it was a combination of that, and then also my dad ran a theatre, and so we used to have, a Saturday afternoon matinees, and I would, you would go there and be parked in front of. There was always a band playing in the bar, and it was very 70s. And you get your bottle of Coke and your packet of crisps, and that was your sort of entertainment. And you might, if there was a kids show, go and watch that, And then I think from a young age, I did sit through long, boring plays and fall asleep on, and then, if your mother's an actress, then you have to go and see her play Goneril, and then you have to go and see her play Lady Macbeth, and my poor brother will never go to the theatre again, I think. But for me, I realised that all of those things, a combination of watching probably a lot of television and watching a lot of television with my grandparents and watching a lot of theatre, and these two just language, I guess. This kind of incredible sense of language was a really important part of growing up.
Did you literally watch from the wings as your mother was on stage? Were you in the audience? Were you on the stage to the side?
I was often. I mean, I think probably more from when my dad ran the theatre. It was always, I remember they did a production of Alice in Wonderland, and everyone was saying, "Come backstage, come and see." And they showed me how they turned the white flowers red, and how they made the teacup go small, and I just remember feeling like, why are you showing me all this? I don't want to know that, So actually, there was a sense of sort of, it was kind of interesting seeing someone pulling bits of ropes and flowers changing colour. But I think there was also it is that, the smell of the grease paint, but it's the smell of MDF is very comforting for me, but it's also slightly kills magic, so it's but I guess it's about making again. It was about seeing behind and thinking, okay, how do you make this?
Yeah. Your early plays, and even plays up to the Mistress Contract, you've done now about a baker's dozen of plays, have often been lauded for being innovative, for kind of playing with form. As you moved into television in the early aughts in 2000, 2002, did that translate well to the television medium?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think sometimes when I've tried to think about changing the form in TV, it's been a lot harder. I'm terrible at maths, and it's quite mathematical television, and just episodically working out story. And so I definitely think what was great for me in theatre, and why I'm a real advocate for writing in theatre, is that it is just you, and you are absolutely king of the hill in theatre. Everyone remembers the playwright's name. They very rarely remember the screenwriter's name, unless you're Aaron Sorkin, who I love, by the way. But and so it is a great place to play, and it's a great place to try out form, and and everything is I'm a huge admirer of Carol Churchill, who's an amazing playwright in the way she plays with form, and so I loved the fact you could do that. But I think TV was harder. They would I found in television I would talk about a story and they'd say, "What do you think it is? 260s, 190? What? Or is it 680s? And that was very interesting to me. Suddenly, okay, you have to make story in a different way. Yeah. So, but I do think it liberated me being able to experiment in that way in theatre. Yeah.
Which brings us to the hour and how extraordinary it is. How did that come around?
Well, I mean, I had a long relationship with Jane Featherstone, a producer at Kudos, and we had worked on various things before. And I'd also, her sister Vicky Featherstone runs the Royal Court Theatre, so I had, done a lot of plays with her. And so she'd said to me, we'd started to talk about doing something around the Suez Crisis, actually. And I suddenly thought, God, the Suez Crisis is so dry, it's so heavy. And she said, this amazing period in the BBC at that time, the way they reported that story. And actually, it was through looking at the Suez Crisis through the eyes of the BBC that we suddenly opened up this incredible world. And it was fascinating to me because suddenly you didn't have the mobile phone and you didn't have instant text messaging. And it brought back this wonderful sort of sexual dynamic in the workplace. And it was such an extraordinary time because it was post-war, where women had started to find their voice. Well, men had been away, and yet they were still, 1 in 6 women worked in the BBC, and they were secretaries. And so I thought, okay, there were these occasional maverick women, and so I just loved that world. And I looked at His Girl Friday and The Apartment and Billy Wilder, and I suddenly thought, this is the place I can do Billy Wilder dialogue. I mean, not I wish, but certainly the rhythm, the speed, the energy of it. And again, it was, I guess, the chance to play. So in a way, when you say that question about theatre, what was that like, bringing that change of form? A lot of the times I try and find worlds where I can fit a different form. And so, if you listen to the hour, it has a huge rhythm to it, and I would literally write it and score it like a piece of music.
I was going to say it's very musical. It's got a very musical sense, all the dialogue. You must have researched it, obviously, within an inch of its life all the time. Did you research it well?
I mean, you do research well, but it's amazing. It's, I do have the brain of a goldfish because I sort of take it all in, and then it just, as soon as you've used it, it just goes. And so I think people often, I often get asked, I remember when I did sex trafficking, I'd be invited to these incredibly important kind of UN conferences to come and talk about sex trafficking, and I'd be thinking, God, I've read 3 books and I've met a few women, and it would always, research is really essential when I'm in it, and I absolutely absorb it, but it is also, you cannibalize. And so there was something when I was working on the hour, I'd read and read and read, but there's a point where you have to put it down. You have to let go of that, and you have to free yourself up, and then you can go back to the research and say, okay, I've done this. Is there a model that this could, or is there a character, or was this possible? And so that's when I go back to the research.
Let's talk about the long form system that obviously was maybe your first time with the hour, kind of really being able to enjoy that and kind of have character arcs that went 8 episodes and could span over into 2 seasons. Preferably 3, didn't get another one after that. But how was it going into the hour and really realizing that, I can do this and I can set up these little morsels that I can come back to 3, 4, 5 episodes later?
Well, I'm hugely admiring of American television, and certainly long form American television. I still don't know quite how you do it over here, because what I struggle with is I don't know quite how to set up a writer's room. I always write my own episodes, and we brought on 2 very, very good writers, but we literally didn't have enough time to work with them, so there was obviously a lot of, rewriting. And but for me, with the hour, series is a beast. It's an absolute beast, and what I loved about it and what was fascinating to me was this idea that characters came to life and they were utterly owned by the actors and not just for one film. So it wasn't just that kind of 9-week period where you got to know actors and then met them at the premiere. It was that sense of, no, we're going to commit to 5-6 months and we want to see you next year. And that became very exciting, because then I could really start to build and develop. And I think the cast on the hour are really inspiring to me. The dynamic of Romola Garai and Dominic West and the brilliant Ben Whishaw, and then bringing on Anna Chancellor as Lix and Peter Capaldi, who everyone knows now as Doctor Who, and that was just, they were just fantastic to write for. And that's the most exciting thing for me now, is that casting for me is everything, because if you get those great actors, then they will be the character that make you want to write. And that's why I was genuinely heartbroken when they cancelled the hour, because I just had story after story. I had such a, I hadn't got to the Bay of Pigs yet. That was the one I was really looking forward to. So, I wanted to push through and into the, I wanted to get into the 60s.
Yeah. So you had season upon season kind of planned going on. Yeah. Why did they? I mean, low ratings obviously, but was there conversations about it? Did you talk?
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, there was a very strong sense after the second series, we've got to make this again, start writing, and then they just got spooked by the figures. We got 1.7 and it had to be 2. I think it consolidated at 2.1, but that's still not enough. And actually at the time I was quite laissez-faire. I was trying to be quite cool about it. I was like, yeah, well, you kill your darlings, you move on. What I realise now, I've just written another series called River for BBC and Netflix, and it's so hard. For me personally, I find series writing really, really hard, because it eats up story, and you have to be consistent. And as I said, I'm not a great mathematician, so I'm constantly trying to work out the through line of the plot. And I realised what huge energy it takes to make something, and how much we'd got the ball rolling with the hour. And so I was really excited to write for the 3rd series, and also we had every single actor signing up to do it. But I was very, very lucky to get 2 series, and if it doesn't sell, it doesn't sell. You have to just throw your hands up. But ultimately, what's very weird for me with the hour is it's the one show still to this day that people come up and go, hey, is there going to be another series of the hour? And there really isn't. And I will always be sad about that. But how lucky was I that I got to write it, really?
Would you do it for American television? Would you do it for like an AMC or something? I mean,
yeah,
I just wanted to come back.
Well, I'd love to. I want to do. I'm very interested in. I've got some ideas at the moment in terms of I'd like to have got into the 70s, and I love the 70s period, and I'm a big fan of broadcast news. So. Yeah. And then so I don't know. We'll see.
Well, it's an extraordinary show. I really seek it out if you don't know it. And let's talk about River, because that's obviously a new show that you've got going on with Stellan Skarsgård. He plays a detective who hears voices, kind of going into that what we were talking about with identity, the destruction or creation of identity. What was the inspiration for River?
Well, I was really, I was kind of fascinated about the idea of how do you carry on. How do you hold down a job when you're dealing with fragile mental health? And how do you be a police officer or be a teacher or be a lawyer when you yourself might be dealing with something so emotionally overwhelming to you? And why are we so frightened of mental health? We don't worry when someone breaks an arm. We sympathise if they've got back injury, but say to someone, I'm hearing voices, and we go, right, okay, nice knowing you. And so actually it was about taking the curse out of mental health. It was about saying, it's we're all, if we're going to live and breathe and be open human beings, then at some point in our life we may be depressed, or we may be suicidal, or we may have our heart broken, or we may feel psychotic, And so I wanted to create a character who we would fall in love with, I hope, and that we would believe in, and we would believe he was competent and able to solve a crime, and yet at the same time was so deeply affected that he was struggling with his own sanity. And so I wanted to do that, and there was that, and then I wanted the game of what would it be like if everybody you spoke to didn't actually exist, that, and I guess as a metaphor, it's kind of what I do every day. I find it very weird sometimes that I live this huge internal head life where I've, I adapted Little House on the Prairie last year, and so I spent a year, living in Wisconsin and then down to Kansas, and I really was there. And then I'd come in the end of the day, I'd be there with my children and my husband, and I'd think, God, I've been on my own all day. And so I guess it also comes from when you have a huge interior life as well.
You get inspiration from interesting places also. You did a play about Alzheimer's victims in a nunnery, right? Yeah. And that was based on a nonfiction work. Yeah. And I actually think that there's something very interesting about taking nonfiction work like The Invisible Woman, another terrific film, and taking nonfiction work and turning that into a sense of fiction, a sense of introspection within this context of a nonfiction genesis, right? I mean, how did the Invisible Woman come to you?
The Invisible Woman, which is it's basically a social history in a way, written by Claire Tomlin about the 13 years that Charles Dickens had a love affair with Nellie Ternan, who was the daughter of actors. So that was very interesting to me. I was approached by a production company and said, and asked me to read the book. And I read the book, and I was fascinated by. This was a way to see this incredible man through the prism of this young, beautiful, intelligent woman. And so that kind of fascinated me. And it felt like another way of looking at that whole period. And because, he was an extraordinary figure, it was a way to really look at a kind of rock star of the Victorian age. And also somebody who was quietly political and was an observer and a commentator on the world at that time. So for all of those reasons, that fascinated me. But in a weird way, when I approach fiction, be it a real character or not, I sort of approach it in the same way. I don't necessarily see it as anything different. I don't look at, I don't. In a weird way, I treated Margaret Thatcher as a fictional character. I treated Nellie Ternan as a fictional character because it demands that kind of creativity. It demands that you slightly let go and you use the anchoring of the facts, but you still have to. I never met those people beyond stuffing my faces with canapes once, so it demands that you kind of create. It's always a creative process, I suppose.
You've said that you don't know where you're going often when you start a script, that it's really the germ of an idea that you've got, that sparks you, but you don't know what the end is going to be. Is that true?
It is. I mean, it is, but that process can start quite early. And, ultimately I have to write outlines because you have to convince someone to give you the money to write the script. So it's not that I sit there sort of lying on my chaise longue going, I don't know where this is going. But I do, I quite like that idea actually. But I do, but I give myself the freedom not to know where it's going because it can become incredibly prescriptive and therefore it's a dead script. Right, so yeah, I try and keep that as open as possible.
Right, you may know what the end point is, but the subtlety of getting there is
quite linear. I'm quite linear actually. I can't sort of go forward until I know what's. Yeah, I don't kind of suddenly leap ahead and then come back.
Right. What can you tell us about just in conclusion about that favorite script of yours that has never been made? Why hasn't it ever been made, and what's it about?
God, because it's about death and the afterlife, and I just think it's not it's a. I don't know. Maybe one day. One day.
Yeah. And do you go back to it sometimes? You go and visit it and say, I'm gonna shine
Whenever
this up
I meet
bit?
an actor who's perfect for a part, I'll think, shall I send them that script? But I've tried every configuration to make that script work. So I've slightly lost. It's like a sort of bastard Frankenstein script now. So I don't even. People keep saying it's too big budget, so I set it in a small village in Berwick, and then they go, it's too provincial, so then I take it back to Arizona. So it's like it's a schizophrenic script. I think it will probably be a horrible film for now.
No, I'm sure it'll be fantastic, like all of your others. Ladies and gentlemen, Abi Morgan.
And I'll never forget walking into the room. It was a rainy day in New York. We were downtown, and I walked into a room and absolutely sopping wet. And there was Julianne Moore, and she said, "You even look like my son." And I was like, I've never been so grateful for my freckles in my life. I was like, thank you.